We're all building at Tottenham Court Road, and
our labs.
Economic impact, I think, on the visual arts sector, and maybe perhaps thinking more broadly about kind of cultural institutions and the impact on these kind of sort of structures. So I kind of wanted to slightly address these, and I guess as primarily a practicing artist, I'm slightly taking a kind of slant of thinking about, not that I'm representing all artists, I wouldn't ever want to claim to do, but thinking about the impact on artists in relation to the fallout from COVID. And so when I was thinking about, I think the kind of economic impact, obviously we know about the kind of devastation that sort of happened, and obviously recently the government has launched this initiative. I think in just terms of thinking about artists, what COVID has done is really highlight, I think, systemic inequalities, and particularly in relation to economic structures. And I think it's highlighted the precarious nature of artist employment. And for me, that is something that I think that is urgently needs to be addressed in terms of how artists, you know, I'm in quite a fortunate position of being able to supplement my income through teaching, but lots of artists are employed, underemployed, are often working in precarious areas of the economy, unstable areas of the economy. And even when they're working within the arts sector or working as artists, they are often underpaid or not paid at all. And I think that's something that I think ultimately does really need to be addressed. I mean, I know there are wider concerns about institutional funding, but I think this is an ongoing systemic issue. You know, I know we're thinking about perhaps the immediate impact, but for me, there are wider questions when I think about, you know, the position of artists. I think, again, about more within society, I think, income disparities, and for me, something that's really important, in addition to being pragmatic and thinking about specific short-term, medium-term, but it's also, I think, a need for utopian thinking. And you know, there've been many debates about the universal basic income, but I think that's something that needs to be kind of pushed, needs to be inserted into kind of sort of public discourse. I think as well, you know, for me as well, in terms of really thinking about the kind of distribution inequalities across the kind of country. I mean, I even though I live in Cambridge, I actually teach and spend quite a lot of time in Leeds. And again, I'm really aware of these kind of disparities, I think, across the UK, and something that I was really mindful of in terms of the government's sort of extra funding that it's put into place for the cultural sector is actually what will be the distribution of that across the UK, particularly when there are already these kind of inbuilt inequalities nationally. So I think for me that is a kind of sort of real concern that needs to be kind of addressed. I don't know, I was thinking about just addressing the kind of cultural institutions and the need for change within that. Really, I think it's important for us to kind of return and really recognise the kind of social, cultural and political impact of the last few months. And people have made lots of analogies with the Second World War. And I think for me, one of the more important ones is actually thinking about the aftermath of the Second World War and the Marshall Plan, which, again, I think when we're thinking about the impact of the last few months and COVID and the ongoing impact, the fact that we're still in the middle of this, I mean, people are we're sort of talking about like we're out of it, but I'm still thinking about the fact that there are, what, 50, 60,000 people dead. So I think for me, a real kind of need to kind of systemically address across the board, social, political, cultural, everything, like and what certainly that Marshall Plan, I think, from the 40s represented on a slightly different scale. But I think big thinking is really, really important. And I wanted to sort of address as well, I think in the outline that JJ gave, in addition to COVID, there's been, I think, the fallout and tragedy of George Floyd's murder, which horrifically was broadcast across the world. And obviously, I think that's been an important moment in terms of kind of raising consciousness. And we've seen the shows of solidarity, and I think there's been a lot of obviously the kind of sort of protest and anger and that sparking of emotion. And I think cultural institutions have shown their solidarity. But again, I would sort of highlight, I think, the importance of, again, sustainable systemic change within institutions, and really thinking about how we kind of sort of monitor that, so that we don't have, you know, a few seasons of recognizing diversity or addressing cultural disparities and visibility, and then that sort of disappears. So for me, you know, evoking the suffragette mantra, deeds, not words, is something that I'm really kind of mindful of. Looking within institutions, one thing that I'm sort of mindful of is actually hierarchies within particularly visual arts institutions, and thinking about, for example, a very tangible example for me is if one looks at programming and institutional structures. I'm somebody that works quite a lot within social arts and participatory practice, and as a result, I've worked quite a lot with learning and education departments. And institutionally, this is often where you find people of colour, it's where you find women, it's where you find queer people. And what I'm always really mindful of is in how institutional hierarchies kind of ghettoize, I think, the practices and discourses that are born out of learning and education departments. This is something I'd really like to see addressed in relation to institutional imbalances, because I think already within lots of institutions, certainly publicly funded institutions, there's a tremendous amount of work and practice. But what I would really like to see, I think, is these areas being given visibility, criticality, and recognition. And it's not necessarily about you know, making learning programs, putting them in exhibition spaces, but I think it's about institutions actually recognizing who are you working with, where are they working, where are different sorts of artists working, and actually what's born out of these practices. So that's just a kind of specific area. I'm sort of aware that I might have gone over my 5 minutes, but I'll just maybe sort of finish off by, okay, 1 minute, thanks, Jamie. I think I would like to see, and I've had a few conversations with other artists about, again, I think particular institutional kind of sort of labeling and kind of framing, particularly of things in relation to kind of diversity and inclusion agendas, and how now I think there's a real discussion about how sort of the BAME tag has become particularly kind of redundant. And I think for me, what's been sort of born out of, I think, recent events is the need to really think about, as well as the intersection of various, I think, identities, but to think about the need to address specific needs. And if one takes the kind of very broad BAME umbrella, and I recognise it's not often institutions that are pushing this, it's often governmental structures and funding structures that develop these criteria, but I think it would be good to see a kind of pushback. I think it's important that we really recognise that within these broader umbrella categories, that they often kind of mask inequalities, and I think they allow institutions to get away with not addressing specific needs of specific communities. So one might think about like the ridiculousness of, like, you know, the A being, you know, addressing kind of Asian ethnic minorities, but thinking about the specific disparities within that really broad kind of category. So I think that's, for me, a kind of very specific point, but something I think, again, needs to be addressed. I'm going to stop.
Fantastic. Thank you, Harold. That's terrific. I'm going to push straight on to Brett. If you would mind coming on, that's good.
Yes. So I'm coming from thank you very much, JJ and to Sasha, and very nice to see so many people I know in the audience tonight. I'm, of course, addressing this matter from an institutional level and from our recent experience with being having to close down and reopen, and we do reopen in a week's time, so we're living right through it at the moment. So just to, I just thought it might be interesting to recap on the processes we've been through since March 17th, when we closed down. We immediately went through sort of 3 distinct phases of, first one was about looking after the safety and anxiety of the people that we worked with, our staff, the artists we were working with, and our freelancers, who were all very concerned about their contracts, as well as dealing with the security and the fabric of our building, because we did leave it at a time, we left the building, of course, with people-less for 4 months, and we had to really look after the very valuable works of art we had in that. Then the most important thing we had to address very quickly was the financial solvency, because although we are a charity, we do have a very successful enterprises arm. You know, we have been encouraged all these years by the Arts Council to develop new forms of income generation, and we've done that very successfully, to the point that we're only reliant on the Arts Council for 25% of our funding, and the rest we generate now from our own funds. So we have suffered enormously whilst being closed. And thirdly, of course, we had to immediately think, how are we going to serve our audiences and our communities now that the conventional models were impossible? And that required upskilling of all our teams, because everybody suddenly had to do Zoom lectures, talks, patrons tours, etc., and conduct everything digitally. And that's been a great learning experience, and something obviously we will continue into the future. So now, with our opening next week, next Tuesday, I hope you'll all come along. We are coming out of this triage stage and getting into our recovery phase. And we're readjusting to the new normal, in which all cultural organisations will have to demonstrate that they are much more agile in adapting to the dramatic changes, as we are unlikely ever to return, as everybody knows, to the pre-COVID state. So business as usual moving forward will feel and look very different. And in this new hostile environment, the ability to innovate and to reconfigure is going to be critical. Right now, we're really focusing on the next 6 to 12 months and what they look like in terms of especially financial stability, because on the 1st of January next year, the Photographers Gallery celebrates its 50th anniversary. Not a very good year to have chosen next year, because we had a lot of things planned, and of course now everything is up in the air, but we really do still have to continue with that and do it in some shape or form. So we're now looking at addressing what our core strengths are, re-examining our mission and what we do that's meaningful to our communities, and who those key communities are, because it's giving us now a chance to really reconsider, especially with the impact of George Floyd murder and the BLM protests and debates, that it really is forcing us, along with all the cultural institutions, to really look very hard and long at those issues, and to look at the institutional racism that exists everywhere, including in our own institution, where whilst we have always been very proud of our very diverse program, we can definitely do more, and where we have a big job to do in making sure there's a diverse staff, especially within our middle and upper management. That's the area where we really need to do far more work. And so we are, of course, working all together, having those very confronting conversations with every team member about how they see this moving forward, and developing an action plan that we can proudly put out to the public and be held accountable to. So that aside, we feel that we need to develop some bandwidth to think beyond the near-term survival and contemplate the organisation's future purpose and program, to decide to really decide some fundamental questions about what is the world we really want to see in the future, and how can we contribute to that and move from the non-normal to the next normal. So it is definitely for us all a moment to recalibrate. We know that we have valued too much certain types of art, such as the blockbuster show and the International Art Fair and Festival, but I believe it's time, as we all do, that these priorities are being rethought. So in this period of non-stop turbulence, where our resilience is being tested, we all individually are also being tested. And it's going to take some terms to come to terms also with the deep social scarring that we've seen everywhere, not just as a result of the Black Lives Matter protests, but also that's been happening even with our own staff and our own visitors who seem very reluctant to come back. JJ quoted a creative industries survey, but there was a Museums Association survey which quoted last month that 39% of people don't feel that they're unlikely to visit a museum and gallery for a very long time, and nearly 60% said that they'll watch what happens within the next month before even deciding whether they'll come into central London. So that's going to have a dramatic impact on people like us who are unfortunately based right in the heart of the West End. So the ecology of our sector is going to change dramatically. So I just want to conclude with a few important pointers to what we can do that we feel needs to be done as a sector to contribute to bring about change. I think we have to rebuild the arguments away from the economic argument and the building tourism argument that has always sustained the arts in the last few years, and focus on addressing our contribution to civic life and to how we as the arts contribute to individual well-being. We have to look much more closely, as Harold also mentioned, at the fragility of the labour market. We are all so dependent on freelancers and artists who have this very fragile economy, and we're going to have to all work harder to devise new ways to support them. And finally, we are especially impacted by cultural tourism. It has collapsed, and 4 out of 5 tourists who come to London say the main thing they come for are museums. So we are going to have to develop a new strategy of focusing on the hyper-local, especially for an organisation like us. So I don't think everything's grim. I'm a systemic optimist, and I do think I always look to the power of the artists and the talent of the institutional people who run the gallery sector in this country for wisdom and leadership, and I do think we can find our way through together as a sector, and I am hopeful. So I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic, thank you, Brett. That's really really interesting to hear from being in the thick of it, and I'm sure I'm going to hear more of that also from Fatos. But I'm going to bring in Chris now, who is there. Not muted. Yes, good. Okay. So Chris, over to you.
Great, thanks Sasha for the invitation, and JJ for organising today's event. I put together some thoughts which I'll just sort of share with you, and we'll take it from there, and hopefully they echo some of the points that have already been raised. So I work at Art Monthly, and I'm sort of increasingly conscious of not wanting to add to the deluge of writing that surrounds the pandemic. And as someone who commissions tried to work for more engaged positions of what the pandemic has affected globally and its interrelations to parts of the art world, I think we're all conscious of not wanting to participate in a discourse of excitement of opportunities that may have arisen around what is disproportionately affecting and killing people of colour, those in care homes, and the vulnerable in society. The subject of the death of the public space raises several interesting considerations, though, not least the spectre of what constitutes public space, but who has access to it. But I'll begin by drawing on my work at Art Monthly and covering some of the specifics of being an art critic at this moment. As most organisations, we are working remotely from one another, but relatively smoothly, in part due to the largely solitary nature of writing and editing. A reasonable degree of continuity has been possible. Beyond places of research being closed, we largely continue to work in the familiar locations of our bedrooms and kitchens. However, it is more the infrastructure that financially supports our undertaking which has been affected. And here, like most, if not all magazines and periodicals, advertising has been affected alongside obvious over-the-counter sales of the magazine. Specifically, our advertising is largely made up of public institutions promoting their work rather than commercial galleries, so we have a stake both ideologically and financially in the protection of public galleries and museums being open and accessible. As a black and white, critical and independent magazine, we hope that the continuation of the magazine covers the gap in conversations which are unable to take place while we are in lockdown, but also, like this talk, analyse the obfuscating narratives peddled by the UK government and comment upon the complicities and shortfalls of the public and private sectors with a depth of consideration that is perhaps missing on social media. I should briefly add that as a writer and editor, I'm often travelling to see artists, galleries and museums taking part in talks and events, and so on around the UK and internationally. All of these activities drive part of what we commission and bring into the magazine. So there are adjustments and changes that we've had to adapt to, and maybe we can talk about that as well. Interestingly, in the US, Art Forum has reduced its number of published magazines this year as part of what it terms a downturn in the number of exhibitions and activities. We haven't. Arguably, there is still a huge amount of writers to cover and comment upon. So what is perhaps more evident is the vested and financially interrelated interests that circulate around artworks and attendant discourses. We similarly have seen the concerted efforts of art fairs and sale rooms to move online quicker than anything, but including often tiring roundtable Zooms. And people like Jerry Gagosian, who's sort of infamous on Instagram, both punctures and embraces this particular fascination of the commercial art world, fetishizing its own reflection. However, moving closer to the places where I work, the mid to long-term effects of the pandemic in terms of livelihood, jobs and income are still hard to picture. Despite initial bailouts and subsidies offering some solace, it's still hard to know how this will shake out. It seems that after October and at the end of the furlough scheme, we'll be seeing far more redundancies and unemployment. Sadly, the precarity of most artists and writers and critics I know at the moment is keenly felt. And I think it's important to say that the conditions, racial injustices, socioeconomic hardships, and endemic exploitations occurring before the pandemic are still present, rather they've been exacerbated, violently so, over this period. And indeed, the public space, which is considerably under surveillance or policed, structures the visibility of certain bodies over others to punishing effect. And I mentioned, as Karani Barocca in a recent article for Art Monthly points out, the inherent ableism that continues to go unchecked. She writes, the swift adoption by most art organizations, in many cases in the first few days of the pandemic, of remote procedures to enable staff to work from home, often developing support systems to make it easy as possible, is something disabled and chronically ill people have been campaigning for in the arts for many decades. In other words, it is only when non-disabled people's livelihoods are at risk that these measures are seen as an urgent necessity. And I think AICA points to how public space, which is no longer completely accessible, is predicated on a certain ableism, where disabled people have continually faced barriers to public spaces. Indeed, how far will public institutions such as galleries and museums adapt to conditions forced by pandemics remains to be seen, but one which increasingly seems that we might have to look elsewhere to find it, rather than look to our current institutions to bring change. One can often feel that directors of institutions are, as Sarah Schulman says, they look in a mirror and see a window. And by that, I mean there is a desire by institutions to reflect muted versions of radicalism as and when fashionable. I had an interesting conversation this morning about restitution, and it's welcome news that Arts Council is taking some initiative on restitution, and that will be released this autumn. Otherwise, the utilization of the one relatively public space available, the website, has, in the rush to provide online content during the pandemic, revealed the inherent institutional anxieties of necessitating presence, sometimes failing the artwork and the viewer in the process. We are further enough along in our history of online experiences to recognize that digital space cannot replace or function as public space, nor are they commensurate. The fact that we are increasingly dependent on these private forums, and as we are pushed into using them with ubiquitous ease, it raises the question how we critically assess them, if not consider alternatives to these increasingly embedded tools of online communication, from workplaces to museums, and particularly in the case of art schools and teaching. And just to end, it seems that one of the few things to have happened during this pandemic is the need for conversations such as these to take place. And hopefully these are not only sustained, but actually can be built upon.
Fantastic, thank you, Chris. That's super helpful. And I think there are quite a few points there I think we're probably going to turn around a lot. I just want to say to everybody that before I move pass the floor to Fatos, if you are ready to question and you have points to make, do raise your hand so I can start to see where to come to once we've finished with the panelists. Let's finish and move on to Fatos, please. Over to you.
Thank you, JJ, and thank you, Sasha, for the invitation. I have to say, when I received the title of the event, I was quite taken by it because it is very speculative. I mean, if you could always say it's almost like dystopian. It's provocative, like the death of public culture, and scary at the same time. But definitely, you know, like implementing something that we need to be thinking about. What is public from now on, what is public realm, as well as, you know, like what is culture, like what is it, you know, how I think I really am very glad all our speakers, you know, like what Harold, Chris and Brett said, does definitely resonate with also accessibility, representation concerns that we all had. And I think something that COVID-19 pandemic brought forward is this kind of acceleration of certain concerns or blind spots in arts and culture, as well as in whole society, I would say. But it's also about, like, you know, we've been through this enforced period of reflection. It wasn't something that we were expecting, but however, it's been something that I think been giving people a lot of anxiety, uncertainty and instability, and those are not necessarily positive feelings to kind of empower growth or progress. But I do feel, you know, like after, and then if we look at in history, I like what you were referring to, Harold, of the Marshall Plan. But if you also look at in history, like when there were certain big movements, such as if we think about the late 20th century, 1968 or post-1968 or post-1989, have been really important moments, not only for arts and culture and the shifting of structures or power mechanisms, but also at the same time in society. So after with Liverpool Biennial, it's also quite interesting to be part of the panel today, because if we were still on a non-COVID world, we were actually opening our 11th edition today. So, and as you know, it's postponed, but I would imagine if we were doing that, we would probably be continuing the business as usual, you know, a party, big gathering, international visitors, press conferences, lots of drinks. And what's happening now is with our new dates, which will be 20th of March until 6th of June, with 2 days prior, we're really rethinking everything. And as you can imagine, a biennial is a gigantic structure. It's almost like, I mean, I recently made this analogy of, like, you know, a puzzle composed of 8,000 pieces. And when you're trying to move a biennial to a following year, in a world that is impacted by COVID and a global, very important, urgent, you know, call for equality, diversity, and inclusion with the triggered by the Black Lives Matter movement, it becomes 80,000 pieces, because each piece needs to be also contested and chartered and reevaluated and assessed and questioned, you know. So of course we are definitely looking into our public programming. We are looking into, like, the possibility of delivering some of the projects as in the scale or in the merit that we can. But, you know, like, there are a lot of concerns and questions. And of course, you know, like 2020 brought us two new words into our vocabulary, furlough and Zoom. So it's not been easy also to run an organization where we have furloughed our staff, not only for financial reasons, but because, you know, like, of the circumstances that they have been living. They live in flat shares. They, you know, not only work from their kitchens and living rooms, but they have worked from their bedrooms, and it's been not easy to also, like, experience. Something that has been very important, I would say, for us during this time is this two words, that is solidarity and care. And I know they're very weighty words, and perhaps you might also say, you know, like they might be quite convoluted. What does that really mean when we mention solidarity or when we mention care? However, that's been something important that we prioritize to have with our artists, as well as, you know, like most importantly, our staff, our, you know, like partners, because with Liverpool Biennial for this edition, we were working with 18 venues, so from Take Liverpool to FAC to Blue Coat to warehouses that are in the Fabric District, and yeah, I mean, but I don't necessarily want to kind of like talk about what's been happening with the biennial, but perhaps like really reflect on what do I see as, let's say, you know, like medium-term consequences and the long-term consequences of this global if I could say, tragedy and call for truth of the right of, you know, like humans is I think something that is very important to look at is how do we relate to change? Because we've all been speculating about, yes, the world is not going to be the same. It's going to be different. But are we really ready about it? I don't think so. I think we're still in the kind of, how can I say, in that grief state of not really wanting to let go. And I think in midterm, what's going to happen is we will still try to hold on to certain structures, you know, like certain positions which actually validates what we do. So how can we actually embrace uncertainty to a way in which we also can be open to be challenged from our positions, from our standing points, from our vocabularies, from our languages. So one thing I would really like to discuss. The other thing is the economic disparity. I think that is very true. We are not looking to a world that is, you know, a rose garden without thorns. And I do totally agree with Harold about also this heightening or highlighting or amplifying the inequality of precariousness in the arts and culture. For instance, there has been a recent survey that they're expecting 25% of classical musicians to drop out because they won't be finding jobs, because they're freelancers, they won't be getting paid enough to earn a living, so they will try to get other jobs. I don't even want to speculate for arts, for visual arts especially, because it is so true, the artist pay isn't really healthy. You know, we try to employ people and how can I say, get big projects off the ground with very minimum contributions, or it's always about, okay, this is a strong you know, possibility for you, or this is a strong opportunity for you to be more visible, so please, you know, agree to have a smaller fee. One day in the art market, when once your work is sold, you can get your, you know, investment back. I would very much you know, like to work on how can we actually put in structures that support artists, and that actually also, you know, I've had the pleasure and the privilege of working with many artists to date, and something that they would question was, why don't I get the same pay as the cleaner gets on an hourly rate, you know? So let's really think about that. I think that will be very important. I'll leave you with the last speculation, and that is about the public realm, because that's something I'm very passionate about, to think and to really understand. And having moved to Liverpool a year ago, it's been very interesting for me to, like, let's say, revisit some of my understandings or values through learning a new city and through learning its history, its legacies, and it's also, you know, and it's also potential future. And it's been a city of multiple turmoils. So something that is very interesting in that realm is that, you know, like, how could we really engage in a city where, you know, where it's digitally poor, they're not Wi-Fi. So yes, of course, many cultural institutions went to explore digital platforms, but not every household has a laptop or a Wi-Fi or a smartphone. So how do we do? What do you do then? And secondly, it's about accessibility and representation. If the city centre doesn't represent its diverse publics that is living in the city, how could it be a public space? What are the, parameters or dynamics of a space where, bodies meet? And especially given that we will be more regulated, and the movement, the choreography of movement in art institutions as well as on the streets will be more controlled. What do we talk about an encounter? When do situations arise? When do, unprecedented, unstructured meetings happen? And I think that's, something, if we could think about cities, a triangle of people, places, and productivity, how that triangle, or that the triangular relationship reform itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatos. I am going to bring this straight out to everybody. And I have, of course, if you want to speak and make your points, raise your hands, otherwise I just don't know. I hope everybody knows how to raise their hand digitally. If you go into participants, you'll find a button that says raise hand. And I'll see a little blue hand. And I, in fact, have Deborah Duffin, who's been waiting patiently. So, hi. Hang on, you're going to have to unmute yourself. There we go.
Yeah. Well, I've been waiting with great interest. I'm an artist with a 40-year career behind me, and I want to respond to some of the things that both Harold and Fatos have mentioned in terms of artists' incomes, and raise some issues that I feel organisations need to be aware of, and in fact anyone working with artists need to be aware of. I don't know whether people realise, but something like 39% of residencies are actually unpaid to artists. And when you apply, for example, for commissions, and I've been doing commissions for 40 years, and when I first started with commissions, it was a question of kind of like a brief conversation, a handshake, and a few ideas, and we got going. Now, when you apply for a commission, every artist who applies has to write a massive statement about this, that, and the other, several different things, all sorts of, aims and ambitions, and all kinds of stuff, as well as images of work and descriptions and all. It's a massive amount of work. It can take you something like 2 whole days to put together a proposal. And so you've got thousands of artists applying for lots of things, putting in a lot of unpaid work, when only a few people get shortlisted, and of course maybe one or a few people actually get the work. So I think what I want to highlight for all people working with artists is that every time you ask an artist to do something, unless you pay them, they're working unpaid. So the number of hours you have to do as an artist in relation to what you're paid is massive. I mean, in my 30s, when I was at my busiest, I was working 16-hour days, 7-day weeks to get all the work done. And a lot of it was unpaid. And I think we need to raise the awareness of everybody working with artists. And to keep in mind that if you're not salaried, if you're freelance, everything you do unpaid if you're not paid. I've had commissioners who've presented a brief, and we've discussed it, we've made arrangements, everything, and then halfway through the commission they say, oh, and can you do this? And it might be a set of drawings, and I think, well, yes, but you've got to pay me another £1,000 to do that. It's like everything you ask an artist to do, it does need to be paid.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. Nina Power, who is...
Yes,
there you are. Hi.
Hello, JJ. Yeah, sorry, I got let in a little bit late because I registered really late. But I'd like to raise a sort of question about illegality and illegal art, performance and culture, which relates partly to some of the things that have been happening this summer in terms of raves and certain forms of let's say technically illegal and at the very least risk-taking behaviour in relation to the virus and questions of proximity. And I'm really, really interested in what might happen in a sort of post-plague renaissance sort of way, because often after plagues there are like renaissances. And I suppose it just occurs to me, speaking about questions of funding and so on, what it might mean to actually support anyone who gets arrested, let's say, for putting on illegal kind of raves or performances or theatre productions and so on, which is happening, let me tell you. So these things are kind of happening anyway. And like, as opposed to the kind of old institutions, many of which I would say have kind of capitulated or resigned much of their commitment to certain kinds of values in the past few years, such as the commitment to freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and many of them have capitulated to so-called cancel culture. And there's a kind of question there about how these institutions might adapt to, let's say, a fast-moving desire, which might be actually a kind of grassroots set of behaviours and desires that are already kind of beginning. So that's my question.
Thank you. Are there any others anybody else from the floor at the moment? Because I would like to come back to the panel pretty much straight away on a lot of these points, because I think there's some things emerging from a lot of the comments from our speakers. So unless I see any more, I'm just going to come back and bring Harold, Chris and Fatos and Brett. I think, I don't know how we're going to do this, because I've never actually done this kind of panel discussion where I'm not actually sitting next to everybody. But I mean, I think it's very clear that there are a number of things starting to come out of this. One is, of course, whether we want to hold on to the old institutions and forms that we have had, right? So there's a bit of a tension, and I think an interesting and creative ambiguity in a lot of what is being said by our speakers about what we should value and what we should seek to let go or hold on to, because obviously it is the case that as much as we would like, there are going to be things that disappear and fail, and there are going to be a lot of people put out of work. And Harold is absolutely right, I think, to raise the issue of how many people are already anyway in precarious conditions as artists, and that will only get worse. And it will, of course, not just affect people who are artists or trying to work as artists, but it will affect many, many of our fellow citizens anyway, too. So there is, I think, an issue of what institutions maybe we want, and what kinds of institutions might come after. I mean, I think, you know, for me, historically, it's very evident that some of the kind of dynamics that we might see now are similar to those that might have taken place certainly in the UK during the 1970s, where for the first time the big boom was over, a lot of commercial galleries went bust, inflation took hold, and a lot of artists found themselves very dependent on state funding and state and funded institutions. So this issue of what kinds of institution we want and might look towards, and the kinds of institutions I think we would want to make for ourselves, perhaps, also turns on whether it's something that we rely on the state for, or something that we look to making ourselves in various ways. I think that's certainly important. I think also the point about audiences, and this relates to, I mean, I was very interested in how your points about diversity being broken or redundant as an idea, and I think there is this issue of not only about who is employed and who works in a sector, but also who a sector is for in terms of the audience. And I think because at the moment we are in a very kind of highly fragmented situation in terms of audiences, and in fact audiences are often thought of in a very fragmented way. So I think that's also an issue about institutions and who they speak for and who they speak to, and who they include and who they ignore. So maybe I don't know if anybody wants to kind of pick up on those, because I do think that that is a very serious issue, because it is going to be not about just what survives or holds on, but what comes, what kinds of institutions and what kinds of audiences come out of this situation, which are new, in fact, or are reformed in certain ways. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in, or, I mean, I'm not quizzing you. I'm just interested in those ideas. But I think it also relates to some of the things that Nina is pointing to, with the idea that actually informal or self-made culture might be happening outside of the regulated or the official forms of institution. And that also means like the market, right? I mean, you know, the market is crumbling as we speak. You know, we keep seeing that art fairs are halting and postponing indefinitely, and we are in a very interesting moment where, as Chris was perhaps hinting, that the dominant forces are no longer going to be dominant for a little while, and may not return in the same way, actually, as they have been in the last decade or so, or 2 decades even. So I don't know who wants to respond to each other, or one or two of the contributions from the floor. Chris, you seem to have frozen. Oh no, you haven't frozen. Okay. Are we there? Who's got? I mean, I think you know. I think Fatos, you were kind of hinting at this too, in terms of how to make things, how to make parts of that jigsaw puzzle, and what shape they're going to take, and what conditions are going to constrain you or enable you to make things for the next biennial. Try.
I mean, it's not for the biennial, but I'm like trying to think about art practice in general, and then how it's going to also inform institutional representation. You know, the word that Brett used, hyperlocal, it's definitely going to be something that many organizations across the UK, and not only across the UK, but across, you know, I think every country will be bit more aware of the costs of transport and travel, and at the same time, you know, like we've already you know, kind of are aware of the fact that there won't be blockbuster shows in the next couple of years, because you won't be able to meet the costs through ticket sales, because you know, like there will be less audiences going through our big organizations doors or museums doors. And I think something definitely, I mean, like what Nina is saying is quite interesting. I wasn't aware of the like impromptu raves, but there was something that, for instance, there's the Turkish artist Can Altay. He kind of came to be known. He's a practicing architect, or he was an architect before, of his project called Mini Bars. And then it was basically when the government increased taxes on alcohol in Turkey, many people started to hang out in front of the bars, but buying their drinks from the off license around the corner. And then it was like kind of this impromptu social gatherings. But it's not only the mini bars, but I really feel there will be, I mean, there's this kind of like a mathematical term that is like reduction to absurdity, reductio ad absurdum. I really feel it's almost like, you know, kind of how surrealists and Dadaists were formed, you know, after the imprints, or pre and after the imprints of the First World War. I do really think we will start to kind of ridicule what we're doing. I think perhaps we were taking ourselves too seriously, and perhaps that's a healthy way. But of course, at the same time, we will also fetishize what we're doing as well, because that's also what the market and, you know, the finance side of our presences will need. So I think it's going to come, I would speculate that it will go towards 2 directions, and that will be quite extreme as well. And the other thing I'm really speculating about is kind of a democratization of access, perhaps through internet, or perhaps through using digital platforms, where many artists of various different backgrounds will be able to showcase. But I do, you know, totally agree about fees and payments, etc. But I do feel since lockdown started, I've been coming across with more artists that I wasn't really aware of their practices because of, you know, this unprecedented procrastinating periods that you go through while you're, you know, overwhelmed with the Zoom conversations.
Thank you. I'm kind of looking at, this is weird because I've got the physical cues here. Harold.
Yeah, I was just going to maybe address the point that Deborah made. I think I think I think, you know, just about kind of sort of artists not being remunerated for, I think, the work and free labour that we do. I mean, I think one of the systemic problems is that sort of, you know, artistic practice and the discourse surrounding the idea of the artist is so individualistic, you know, and I think that sense in which there's a kind of lack of kind of collective bargaining, for want of a better word, has meant that I think often that artists are sort of open to be kind of exploited, really, in relation to actually taking account of actually, you know, the forms of labour that we actually do. And I don't know, I mean, you know, there are organisations, associations, unions, artist unions, but I feel like that's a kind of real kind of conversation that needs to really have some momentum in terms of really, I think, artists really kind of getting together and forming sort of structures to really say, look, this needs to be addressed. And I think, you know, I have lots of individual kind of conversations, and there's often, for example, you know, there's no transparency in what different people get paid. You know, I mean, you know, organisations like Artist Newsletter and sort of promote and their ideas of certain kind of models and types, but there's very little transparency. And, you know, unless you're having conversations with friends or something, it's very difficult to know, like, even what to charge when you're asked to charge things. So I feel like there needs to be, for me, and again, maybe I'm just very sort of statist and old kind of leftist kind of sort of union sort of structures, but I think that for me is one of the kind of ongoing systemic sort of problems, I think.
Okay, cool. Chris, you were...
Yeah, I was actually just going to try to pick up a little bit on a lot of talk on the sort of the blockbuster show and the sort of paid ticket. And I think in this conversation, we're missing the smaller gallery spaces, like regional spaces that don't have a captive paying audience, and they're just as valid and just as important in terms of what they offer their communities. And so, you know, we can't just allow this, the sort of the Tates, the V&As to kind of dominate a conversation, really. It's got to be about really the breadth of what culture can do, and sustaining that in a more holistic way. Trying to pick up on some ideas of like more of a grassroots organization, or these kinds of other ways in which organizations can be built and kind of formed is interesting. And I think that's what potentially might come out of more of these kind of conversations and this situation we're in.
I have marjorieallthorpe-guyton, who's been raising her hand, and I'd like to bring her in. Marjorie.
Hi everyone. I was just picking up some of the chat, Jo Stockham in particular, where she was, as far as just remind myself, talking about the urgency of the arts, storytelling, play, imagination projects, where artists can be paid to use their particular skills. Well, during this whole ghastly period, what's amazed me is the ingenuity of non-artists. I mean, there's been a lot of making and doing going on in kitchens and bedrooms and whatever. And in fact, I think the V&A is actually collecting stuff, things that people have made. Now, there's going to be a lot of unemployment. A lot of people, that we're not just talking about the impecunious and precariness of situations for artists. The whole employment sector is dire. And artists are the most extraordinary survivors. I think there's this probably apocryphal statement supposed to have been attributed to Richard Hamilton, that the artist was the most sustainable individual for the 21st century, because artists live on many of them on very little, and they know how to make little go a long way. And there are skills there, ingenuity, innovation, imagination, everything that Joe raises, which could be harnessed by the culture, the public space. We've already seen museums and many arts venues had exponential increases in their audiences through online engagement, because people just need the arts. And if we can convince, or artists, as Harold talked about, some kind of collective bargaining, there is a huge role and opportunity for artists to kind of work alongside people who are not artists. And for that, they could be paid. There could be real income streams, because we're all going to have to contribute in different ways. And I think artists have got a great deal to contribute. And we just need to convince our wonderful new Chancellor, who's doing and has done something significant for the arts, that there is a kind of sector of individuals who are special and who have got a role in society which is underused. That's not to go back to the kind of prescriptive, socially engaged practice, which I think isn't always successful. This is a new opportunity. We're in a new kind of situation. So I'd like to go along with developing Joe's ideas there.
Marjorie, does remind me of one of the most popular television shows during lockdown.
Grace and
led by the national treasure, Grace and Working Public. And it has been incredibly successful. Exactly what you were saying. I just want to take up something Harold says about paying artists. Of course, all institutions, we all try to stick to the, the set guidelines of Arts Council payment to artists, and they are across the sector. We usually pay the same, but I must say, we were having a laugh with Mark Searley the other day when he got out a letter or a contract that he had given for a lecture he gave in 1988, and he was still paid the same as today. And I do think that there's time now, especially in the current situation, to have a look again at those fees that we all pay automatically. Always £150 for a lecture, for an exhibition and a gallery with that many works at certain sum. And possibly it is time to revisit all that, because it is shocking how it hasn't kept up with inflation or reflect the reality of artists' lives. But we all do pay those fees, and we all follow a certain set standard. The Arts Council makes sure we do. They check on us.
I mean, I think I'm just going to bring Joe Stockham in next, but it is starting to kind of strike me that there is a debate to be had as to whether, as Chris says, the narrative is set by the bigger institutions, or whether some other form of kind of collectivity or organization, self-organization amongst artists, for example, is allowed to take hold as a kind of dynamic, because there's nothing that pre-governs who should get the public money, if it is the case that public money is one of the major or more important aspects of making arts activity, or the activity of making art possible. So that's just one thought. I mean, I think it's very important. Fatos wants to come in, but Fatos, can I just grab Joe? Okay, you want. Okay, yes, you want to.
Just to
1 point.
Just to refer to Marjorie, I think there is a danger in over romanticizing the fact that artists can live off with very little. I think maybe we need to kind of drop that narrative going forward.
Thank you. Okay, Joe, where are you? Joe Stockham. Has Joe just given up? Where is she? Joe, you there? I can see you. We can't hear you. You'll have to do something to your audio. You are definitely, hang on. There you are. Okay, we got you. No, you're, okay. Maybe we'll, I think there is an issue with your sound one way or another, because you are unmuted. I'll leave you unmuted. If you can figure it out, shout, and we'll hear you. Okay. I guess I just want to push a bit maybe on this issue then, Fatos, over-romanticizing the poverty of artists. I mean, I think that's certainly the, go on.
It's not only artists as well, you know, like I've been independent for 15 years before becoming institutionalized. So it's also, you know, and then most of the time when I was an independent curator, was referred to as like maybe unemployed under, you know, like in disguise, which was not the case. It was a choice. But it's not only about artists as well, I think, in that sense, you know, like what Sasha introduced, supporting young writers, also what, you know, like Chris was referring to. It's about practitioners, and then what are the precarious structures that we kept supporting. Maybe we need to question them. But I also definitely, with the artists, you know, like, oh, they're so imaginative, they can do with very little. Yes, it's a practice that we do, and there's definitely an urgency and an alignment that kind of keeps us going, but also at the same time, it doesn't necessarily, you know, validify that it should be the case.
Is Joe back again?
Chris wanted to say something.
Yeah, no, I think Joe is struggling. Maybe Joe, if you write your comment, I'll read it out whilst your voicelessness persists. But Chris,
You want me to?
well, I mean, I think there's also. I mean, I'd like to kind of open it back to yourself and Harold as well, because I mean, I think everybody's been very coy, I have to say, about what precisely do we put in place. Right. So, of course, I appreciate that we want to pay people more, but as budgets shrink, that will mean what exactly? Will we pay less people more, or more people less, or less people less? I also think that in terms of the big thinking and the kind of Marshall Plan thinking that Harold was referring to, and certainly around the issues of around the debate of what will constitute a positive change, say in governance or say in organization, right? What do we really want? What would be non-tokenistic, and how are we, you know, how arts organizations going to think of, work through the implications of some of the things that Harold's been mentioning? Because if it's the case, I'm sorry, Harold, I misquoted you, it's that the BAME tag is redundant, not the diversity tag, but the BAME tag is redundant. And moving on from that point to the one you made about how actually there are different audiences inside that, for example, the Asian audiences are not going to be the same as others necessarily, then where do we want to put our efforts, or where do we see things evolving organizationally? I mean, institutions is a very heavy word, and we know that art colleges are going to suffer, and we know that small organizations are going to suffer, and I appreciate that we don't want it all to be governed by the Tate and other very large, well-funded organizations in terms of setting the narrative. So the real issue is like, okay, what kinds of forms, and I also take Brett's points about getting away from the touristification of the market for institutions, and also this point about hyper-localism, or a return to a kind of more local attitude to one's audiences. I mean, in a funny way, if the public purse is only supporting institutions to quite a small level, like 20%, for example, it is ironic now that having forced organizations to monetize themselves and become more commercial, the commercial crisis should highlight the nature of the market which is actually there. So I'm really interested in this kind of slightly sort of precarious thing of if we let it go, what do we really want? Because I think that's what we really need to hear from ourselves and each other. Harold, do you?
Oh God! I mean, I think, you know, it's like that thread. You know, once you start to kind of like unravel the thread.
Well, why not?
I mean, well, you know, fundamentally for me, that, you know, the problem is the kind of overarching sort of structure, the kind of like marketization, commercialization, capitalization of culture. That's for me is the ultimately problematic thing. I mean, if we're talking about kind of institutions and sort of and change, for me, an important thing is really, is the question you're asking is like, what do we really, really want? You know, sort of Spice Girl quote, you know. And I think for me, I think it's to really think about the kind of ecology of organisation institutions, and to really establish, you know, the diversity in different models of institutions. And I think what the marketisation has done is kind of completely erode certain models, you know. I think about kind of sort of art centres, you know, multi-form art centres. I think about artist-run spaces. We've got a highly professionalised structure that is very, you know, is all about siloing us into this hierarchical structure where, you know, if we think about kind of artistic trajectories and moving from provincial, you know, smaller organisations up until, you know, your Tates and your big sort of London-based organisations. And I think, you know, something I really would like to see is an expansion of the ecology of kind of organisations, and really allowing different sorts of people, I think, to establish organisations. I mean, I think one of the things that I was thinking about in relation today was, I think one of the questions was, you know, what would I like to do? And I think I'm just increasingly thinking, oh, well, I don't know, I'm sort of really tired about sort of feeding institutions, bigger institutions, and maybe I'm gonna have to just do it myself, you know, just like get off my arse and, you know, start talking to people. And again, I think that's something that's been partly kind of born out of this period of reflection, is that I've been talking to other artists and thinking, oh, well, actually we sort of do know what we want.
Yeah.
But, you know, we've sort of trained into kind of defaulting to the greater institutions, and actually, you know, we're just going to have to just do it ourselves. And I mean, that's also easier said than done. I mean, I'm like I said, I recognise the privilege that I do have in being a certain age and a certain point in my career where I'm able to kind of say that. But, you know, I'm sort of really mindful of actually, again, there's a really cogent point that I think underpins a lot of our conversations. We're making a lot of assumptions about the future, certainly of visual art. I mean, anyone that's working in schools will know that I don't know who the artists are going to be in the future, because, you know, this government has had a consistent attack on eroding arts provision in schools. And I think there's a massive problem that we're sort of storing up in terms of who are these artists going to be? You know, there's certain, the provision across the country is, you know, some kids, you know, get very little access to the arts. So, you know, but to come back to a more optimistic thing, I think, you know, I think not to sort of circulate the kind of romantic sort of poverty aspect, you know, artists don't want to kind of like operate with no money and little pay. It's kind of, there's no sort of pleasure in that, I think, you know. But I think ultimately what comes out of kind of sort of frustration and despair is, I think, the kind of that collectivization, that desire to kind of just do it yourself. We're going to have to just do it ourselves. But
Thank you.
I would like that not to be the only way out.
I'm pointing. So no. I have Robbie Howells who's keen to come in. So thank you, Howell. Robbie, where are you?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank
Hi.
you. I guess I don't necessarily have a question. It's more kind of response to what's being said, and maybe to pick up on Howell's point there about career point. I'm an artist. I've done a BA, I've done an MFA, I'm now in the first year of a PhD. And I think I would like to talk about kind of intent and a broadening of knowledge insofar as the languages of institutions, specifically, let's say my relationship with a university at the moment, but I also was artist in residence at London Metropolitan University at the start of the year. And I think I would add in this notion and questioning the notion of local or localisms, because actually, on the one hand, I think there can be very positive ideas around collectivization and working with kind of like-minded people on a kind of simplified goal and things. On the other hand, what isn't being dealt with feels structural, and a widening of thought to address structural languages that we have to be honest, or I think I have to be honest, like the fact of the matter is I'm a white male, cis male artist who is, the barriers to entry are much easier for me as an artist. And actually, that's oversimplify it, but probably factually correct. And so actually, I think a broadening of opportunity for people is about teaching structural languages, not only teaching structural languages, but teaching things like strategy and considering the managerial languages that and the organizational structures that institutions, art galleries, education environments, art fairs, biennials are structured in. And I look to things like football. So for example, football as professional organizations, as far as my research allows me to get to, have fans on the board. Not all of them have it, but what you're having there is, I'm not necessarily talking about horizontal structuring of organisation, but I'm talking about a closing down of the disparity between those that run organisations and those that are trying to either enter them or feel validated by them, or yeah. And one final point I would say is I'm starting to map this out, and I think transparency with Harold is a really, really important thing to consider. I'm working with an organisation called TOMA, who are called the Other MA in Southend, and they are an institution, and I've always been fascinated with the ideas of scale, and I've always been thinking about trying to change on scale. And the woman who runs that is a really lovely lady called Emma, and her first thing she said to me, she was, I've got no interest in scaling up. It's not about scaling up. It's about action in small form. And actually that, I think, is something to be worked through. And I think that's something to be questioned. And I think we need to consider our position as practitioners, leaders, managers in relation to those things.
Thank you. We're running out of time, but I want to squeeze in some quick last points from the audience. Clara Coffin is out there and has unmuted herself.
She has. Thank you, everyone. It's been quite interesting.
Keep it short.
I just want to ask a quick question about resource sharing, because the one thing is like what you're entitled to have as an artist who's working, but I guess like a lot of art also just requires huge amount of resources that institutions, even if they're small, are able to share. And I was just wondering whether, I don't know, any of the people who run institutions have any kind of ideas of whether there are plans to make those resources more accessible so that other people can get their hands on it, so that the art might also get more interesting.
Terrific, good point. I'm just also, I have Olivia Masuto, who doesn't know how to raise her hand, but she's out there somewhere. Where are you?
Sorry.
There you are.
Hello. Hi. I just wanted to share a really quick anecdote. The other day I was talking to another artist, Christina Battle, and she is currently working with the South Asian Visual Arts Centre, which is in Toronto. And we had a really lovely conversation about capital and how that's related to producing art. And I think, Harold, you outlined this really important tension between not wanting to feed the system, but also wanting to continue to work and make art and live. And for one of her projects, she seed shares, but she does a barter and trade system, and she looks at gift economies. And the one thing that really struck me that she said was that she's not comfortable with the expectations required for the exchange of money. And I feel like actually a lot of artists exist in that same space, because you're kind of reducing a lot of this, you're reducing a lot of rich work to kind of either an object or capital. And I guess that's actually, I feel like, something that is also really important to talk about, but that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to try and keep it to time because people are saying that they've got to leave to go to the pub. I think that's what they were saying. But So I'd like, I mean, it's probably worth also everybody having a quick look at the chat, because there's been an interesting conversation, comments going on there, which I haven't always been able to follow. Certainly Nada, for example, is talking about how future programming might be reorganized. Something to do with, she says, I suspect what she's saying is, are you going to change what you've already pre-planned? But also, is there space for selecting selectors? I think this is quite an important issue in terms of, you know, the issues of the level of power that institutions have in all this. And I think it's probably one to Fatos and Brett to pick up on maybe in closing comments. But we have a documenter which is going to be run by a group who are already announcing that they're going to get other groups to run it. I mean, you know, in a certain way. I'm caricaturing a little bit, but also Nina says, Nina Powell says, keep the art and dismantle the institutions, right? So this is a kind of extremist and radical position, and support anyone arrested for putting on illegal raves. Well, that's almost a whole other debate. But I think Nina also makes the point later on, which that the most interesting art and culture will not and does not happen in institutions post-pandemic. Institutions are run by HR, reputation managers, and pie chart molesters, dumping. That is certainly one way of looking at institutions, but there are clearly some tensions. It's been very interesting to have to listen to this conversation, because it's quite clear that it's not just about the romantic poverty. It is about some kind of much more active way of dealing with the fact that all these kinds of arrangements are up for grabs and might be changed. So I am going to ask our panelists to come back with 1 minute of last points and responses to comments. It doesn't matter if it's very smart anymore, because we're quite tired by now. But I think I'll go in the reverse order. So Fatos, if you want to close out for us.
Yeah, with pleasure. So I will also refer to Clara's. I think future is collaborative, and it's going to be even more. And it's not only about like sharing resources or let's say from equipment to research. It's also going to be about like really sharing programming, and especially that's going to be supported by the financial concerns or limitations of organizations. So you might see more and more co-commissions that's happening, and that's going to be across the UK, where an organization can showcase the artist in a different manner in a different city, etc. But there's something that has happened, which I really celebrate Liverpool for, is that we have a Liverpool Arts Organizations Committee, and also it's called LARC, and we also have COAL. We normally meet bi-weekly, and since the pandemic outbreak, we have been meeting weekly, and it's been not only sharing expertise or kind of like our immediate actions that we've been taking, either it's furlough or it is about Black Lives Matter. And that's something to be celebrated, where we have more and more conversations, not only in Liverpool, but also there's been other networks like Contemporary Visual Arts Network that I'm also part of, as well as Tate Plus directors. And I think there was also another network formed specially for London organizations, and they were all different scales. It wasn't only mainstream big institutions. But beyond that, I think it will be really important to kind of first understand what is collaboration and what will be the nature of collaboration. Regarding the institutional practice and institutional critique, I think they are important, Nina. So it's not that I would kind of condemn all of them, but I think the criticality that is needed is always needed, and it has to be something that you can't just take as a one-off. It has to be a consistent diegetic relationship with what we do, why we do it, and what does it really mean. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatos. That's great. Chris?
Cool. I think two things come to mind about the place of the institution going ahead. One being, if we were going to cleave to it, it's the weakened financial position of it in the next few months and years, and invariably then the position of them dependent more on funding, and then potentially the nefarious ways in which people might abuse or use that funding in some way, or it comes from various sources that we find objectionable, and increasingly that already is under scrutiny, and we will see further scrutiny of that. And then second to that, we need to see further restitution of objects and goods, and I think those things as well will come out further towards the end of this year. So I think they're the two things facing larger institutions and institutions in this country. So yeah, that's why I would say that where that is, and as writers and critics, we have to sort of chart and trace that as best we can.
Thank you. Katrina Brown has just left, says that pubs aren't open in Scotland yet. So I take the point. I'm sorry she's not there. She also makes a much more important point that we find ourselves talking about institutions because institutions of whatever scale are where the publicness happens, which I think is an interesting point, maybe one worth considering. I'll bring Brett in for your last comments.
Yeah, Clara, yes, of course, sharing of resources. We're just about to put our archive online, and so we're looking to collaborate with artists to share that resource and to work with that resource. We've never actually shared out any equipment, but it's something that we could look to doing, and to collaborate with artists in that way and assist them by lending the equipment we have. Secondly, about the new ecology that I'd like. I mean, I still think there's a role for an institution, but you know what? An institution like us only works if it has the right ecology around it. And so to me, the most valuable places are the artist-run spaces, the collective that does the Peckham 24 every May down in Peckham. I promise you I find more interesting new photography and image-based work there in those 4 days than anywhere else. And a place like Offprint, that incredible event that takes place once a year at Tate for photo books. And if we lose those really artist-run, very ancillary activities, an institution like us becomes stale. We really do need those to exist in our ecology. And I think that if they get lost, we'll have a responsibility to try and support them. So I regard that as a priority. And lastly, somebody asked me if my program would be changed because of the pandemic next year. And it is true. We are already changing our program so that the show coming up in February alongside the next Deutsche Börse will reflect the issues that have been raised in the pandemic. So yes, we have been trying to be a good thing about a small institution our size is that our programming can be much more responsive and agile. We are lucky that way.
Thank you. And where's Harold? Harold, you were first in and you're last out.
Oh God, I think I probably shot my bolt with my rant before, but I'm just out of desperation. I think I'm just gonna, shocking of all things, just quote Tony Blair: education, education, education. Yeah. You know, I think self-education, I think that's been happening, you know, people sharing reading lists and reflecting, using time either to kind of make and think, engage with new knowledges, think about some of the kind of new productions and new forms of kind of culture, I think that Nina was speaking to, that are being made. And I think also just really looking at a kind of holistic approach to education across the sector, primary, secondary, higher education, lifelong learning. Yeah, that's it really.
Thank you. Wow, okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. That was exhausting. I've never done that before. I just want to thank everybody for coming, and I want to thank the speakers for bringing their fantastic perspectives and contributions to this. What have I done?
Thanks.
I've muted everybody. Okay, sorry. I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you to you for coming. I don't know if, Sasha, you want to make a few last
I just want to say thank you. I really thought it was excellent. And JJ, thank you for chairing, and thank you all for coming. And maybe we can do this again sometime. It was very good.
There certainly seems to be a lot of demand for that. So I don't know how you end these now. I think I might just unmute everybody and just talk amongst yourselves. Thanks a lot, and hopefully we'll do this again soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
I mean, we could just stay here, see what happens.
Yeah, just stay here while everybody goes.
This is the bit in the pub. This is where you have to open your beer.
There we go. Bye, Matt. Bye, everybody. Bye. Bye.
Bye. See you, Sasha. I guess as the host, I hang around till everybody's left.
He's not in the meeting anymore. You can just chuck us all out, James. Yeah.
That's true, actually. That's true. I mean, I'm liking the waving, though. Still, it's bringing back childhood memories. Okay, I'll see you all. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Well done. Thanks.